After having to rush into an emergency distress call only to find out that an entire battle group was getting the crap kicked out of it, the Admiral was not exactly happy. He wanted to know what the hell was going on, and he wanted to know it right now. Most of the intel he received came from the planetary governors and, of course, their own governments. They sent up all the video feeds letting him know exactly what had happened. Along with that, he was getting trickle-in information from the captains of the destroyers and frigates that actually fought off this alien incursion. Though he was not happy that the first thing he had to do was open up with the main guns. The main guns were supposed to be a secret, but now the secret's out. Looking out across his sensors, he noticed there was still a lot of alien vessels still just sitting there waiting. Every once in a while, a shuttle docking with them, waiting an hour and then leaving again. He knew what they were doing. It was a resupply. He'd been well versed in this sort of activity, though he wanted them to hold on resettlement activities until he discussed it with the chain of command, along with the rest of the human governments. The refugees sat on their ships and didn't know what the hell was going on. They were just stuck there, although they couldn't really complain. I mean, first of all, they're still breathing. Secondly, their bellies are getting full. Thirdly, they have at least minimal medical supplies so they can do something. Eventually, the commander was given the reports, not only from his own personnel, but also from what they could get from the alien vessels that were out there. The single alien cruiser that fought on his own side fought well, but the thing was so badly damaged that even as it fired, its weapons began to immediately overheat, overcharge, and simply stopped working or exploded. This meant that the enemy thought it was completely disabled and they were going to take the crew, which meant that it was completely salvageable. However, due to the intensity of the combat, this was the only alien attack craft that survived, only because the enemy wanted it as a prize and not simply target practice. The human destroyers that had to dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge all the way through the battle were almost completely unsalvageable. What was amazing is that they were able to even move after the battle, even though they had expended all their ammunition. Many of their turrets had been blown off, and most of them had extreme damage done to their engines. The frigates didn't do much better. They were hesitant to get close as they were not weapon carriers. These were drone carrier frigates. One was completely salvageable. The other ones had been hit so hard that they were questionable if they would just be sold for scrap or they could be fixed. The strange armored bipedal creatures would arrive at the few alien ships that were still around and bring supplies, but they would never speak. Instead, they would simply load up a recording to let everyone know what was going on outside. Many of those inside began to cry out as they realized that their loved ones on those destroyers and frigates would not be returning. The human-shaped machines moved with mechanical precision, yet every once in a while they would pause and look at a refugee. It was almost as though they were analyzing. Many thought that they just had some sort of glitch or they were rebooting or something, as within a few moments they would simply return to their work. 2 days later, 48 hours is all it took before the system governors called up and they agreed to hold all the refugees until they could return to their space. When the refugees heard this, everyone started to remember an old adage. No one can hear you scream in space, but apparently you can hear people celebrate from across the system. Since most of the alien vessels were large cargo vessels not designed to enter an atmosphere, they had to be shuttled, and human transports were used. As they docked, speakers would put out instructions in their own language for them to load the transports. But as they did, they were all nervous. They walked past these bipedal machines that simply stood there like statues. Though many of them didn't carry large weapons anymore, they were never unarmed, as they could see smaller weapons strapped to the side of one or both legs. They worried if they were simply going to be put in these transport and then put into chains for the use of the humans. The fear was palpable as the shuttles themselves began to enter the atmosphere. When doing so, the shuttles always shake. There's no way of fixing that anyone could find. But with this, many of them believed that they were being shook up just enough that they couldn't hold on to the sides, and the doors were going to open, and they would be sucked out into the atmosphere and plummet to their deaths. And then everything smoothed off. They were inside the atmosphere. They could feel themselves lowering, yet they were still nervous of what was going to happen. They could feel themselves slowing down to land, and they were confused. Many of the older ones were looking at each other puzzled, confused at the idea that there was no thruster noise at all. It was odd, and they could feel the craft slowing so much that there was no bump, no sudden stop. It's though the landing pad simply absorbed the craft. As they heard everything start to cool down, the doors began to open, and for the first time in they had not known how long, fresh air gushed into the bay, relieving all the extra methane and everything else that built up over time. Many of them hadn't seen the outside of any of these cargo bays or any of these holds, and they have no idea how long. Light also flooded in, forcing most of them to cover their faces, cover their eyes, as they couldn't even think about looking towards the sunlight that was coming in from the morning star. That is when they saw the figures. The figures walked up to the door, and as most people were still trying to cover their eyes, they could see shadows. Were these more robots? They couldn't tell. Then they heard strange words and sounds. They didn't know what it was, but moments later, a translator came in with a very mechanical voice. Their eyes adjusted, and they could see humans for the first time. For the first time, they knew exactly what this species looked like. They thought humans were machines. Given the description, they thought maybe they used artificial intelligence. They looked over at those mechanical bipeds that didn't seem to move much at all unless they were instructed to, or they would suddenly just turn and walk again with such a mechanical movement and the stomping on the plates that they just believed that this was artificial. While they gawked in awe at the humans, medical teams rushed in to tend the wounded. They had already been told that a certain symbol meant that medical personnel was there. Those that were still hurt were amazed to see this, as the strange, odd crimson mark gave them a little bit of hope that they would survive just one more day. Those that were not injured were already beginning to be escorted to the holding area. The holding areas surprised them all. These were prefabricated buildings stacked on top of each other, large living areas that they couldn't understand how this was done so quickly. The buildings were stacked one on top of the other, 3 layers high, with stairs leading to each layer, and also some sort of lifting mechanism attached, so those that could not climb the stairs under their own power due to injury or simply being emaciated wouldn't have to worry. When they went inside, they were brought in and shown their new dwelling. There was strange furniture inside, things they had not seen before, though surprisingly most of it fit them. Not all of them, of course. But they realized that they were being treated with such generosity that many of them began to break down into tears. It didn't matter, man, woman, or child. They were just so grateful for what was there. They couldn't believe it. The families, of course, were escorted to one area. Females that were single were transported to another, and males by themselves transported to a third. Of course, families would stay together regardless of how they were mixed in. The Xenos looked around at the dangerous species treating them so well. They could see more of these, what do they call themselves? They looked at the arms of many of them, and they were thick and dense with muscle. It seemed as though they were so thick that they were pushing up against the outer covering layer. They didn't know what was going on. Was this a carapace? Many of them would accidentally rub up against to see how tough it actually was. To their surprise, it was smooth, soft, and rather squishy. But they didn't need to worry about that too much. What they did want to worry about is the fact that most of them had barely been able to eat enough, as the rations that were coming in were usually taken up by the strongest. But now every single one of them found food waiting for them inside their dwelling. They would have to adjust what they ate later for their own dietary concerns, but for now, they didn't worry. They saw a strange data pad, which was in their own language, and they could decide exactly what they wanted to be brought to them, whether they were strictly going to be carnivorous or were they vegetarian. Maybe they were omnivorous, and this was going to be a whole lot easier. Everyone was amazed, and the children were jumping up and down on everything as they found everything so surprisingly comfortable. The parents and the elderly wondered about compensation, as no one ever treats anyone this good for free. Their questions would be answered later that day. A 3D image was shown to each of them at certain assembly areas. Each planet addressed its new residents. They were welcomed to their temporary home, stressing temporary until the humans found a way to return them to their home systems. With this, a few of the creatures began to again cry and beg. Some of them dropped to their knees, others simply passed out. To humans, this was odd. Many of the medical personnel went to see if they had just fallen apart, but no, they found out later it would be something different. While they were there, they would be given food and lodging, compliments of the Vorlon people. They all looked at each other. Vorlon? Don't they mean human? It was explained to them that this was the Vorlon sector, which means they were part of the Vorlon people. Yet, yes, their species was human. Being part of factions, they understood this very well. At least, they thought they did. Within 3 planetary rotations, that's how long they were given to get themselves settled, after which they needed to find some sort of employment. Everyone was confused. What the hell was employment? They didn't understand this. They were informed on how their system actually works, and that they needed to find some sort of position which would give them currency to purchase goods. This would allow all the goods to move around freely, which would in turn feed into the economy doing better, then everybody does better. It's just that simple. Most of those from the faction were still confused at this, as they had never thought of doing it this way. Most everyone was run by domination or some sort of top down or hive mind type system. So this was going to be very interesting. They were informed that since these were agricultural worlds, it would mostly be physical labor. Many of those listening immediately looked at themselves and started to ask, does that mean slave labor? During these 3 days, a female intel officer walked around with her children. She was looking at how things had changed since the last time she had been there. The world was now green and lush. She could actually feel moisture in the air, and when she left, it was a dry, almost arid place. It was horrible. It was difficult for them to do any work. Along with that, they had almost nothing on the humans themselves. Eventually, as she walked from the marketplace towards her domicile, she saw a human standing there, just staring at her as she walked up. The human had this odd, predatory grin on her face. This, of course, made the intel officer very, very nervous, as she believed that the human was going to make her and her children dinner. To her surprise, the human simply yelled out, "It's nice to see you again. This one's grown up well." The intel officer was confused. How does the human know her? She asked this of the human. And the human simply responded, "Oh, yeah, you wouldn't recognize me then. I carried this one to the transport a long time ago." The intel officer thought for a moment, looked at her, and then she suddenly got scared. It suddenly became a full realization that that robot that had picked her child up with such delicate care was simply a human in a suit. But not only did the human take such good care of her child, but also moved with mechanical precision to do her job. What the hell was this? What are humans anyway? While she thought this, the woman knelt down and looked into the young reptilian eyes of the one she had picked up before. He curled back behind his mother, grabbing her tail in fear, and the human just simply looked, realized that she was smiling too much, and this might be something she might not want to do. She moved her hand to her face to actually forcibly close her mouth so she wasn't showing her teeth anymore. It's okay, little one. Around here, you can think of me as your aunt. She stands up, formally introduces herself, and they turn around and walk back. This was surprising. The intel officer didn't realize that she was going to be able to make friends with a human. During this time, aboard the fleet, wounded were being treated as fast as they could. They were still searching the wreckage to find anyone still alive. As they did, one of the bodies, frozen from being stuck out in the ether of space for the past 48 hours, was rolled past extremely quick. His own shipmate looked at him and said, "Oh, he's going to be real mad when he wakes up." Another sailor next to him, getting his arm bandaged up, said, "Yeah, the headache alone is going to put him in a killing mood." Ships were still being searched for any survivors, or at least those that they could bring back. Along with that, they were checking for salvage and intel. When looking into the destroyers and frigates that had faced off against the enemy fleet to start with, everybody was amazed that they had lasted so long. Most of them were just ripped to shreds, as most of their hull had scorch marks, pop marks, all sorts of damage. Many of them, their radars were completely destroyed, blown off, along with half of their turrets. Many of them had engines that were barely functioning, and in one case, the search team had to actually do a quick evacuation as they thought the engine was going to go critical. To their surprise, it was just one small system, and after a quick pop, they went back in and realized that it was simply a subsystem trying to vent the heat that it couldn't vent, and then it simply overheated and popped open. Thankfully, no one was damaged on that, so they continued. Though a few of the destroyers had completely been obliterated, in one case atomized, they realized that their frigates and destroyers were able to hold together a whole lot better than they thought. The corvettes, being so small and so nimble, actually were able to hold out a whole lot better. It turned out by looking at the logs that the corvettes, being so small, so nimble, so agile, and able to whip around and fire a shot, even though this put extreme strain on the crew, meant that they worked just as well as the PT boats from back in the day. When the salvage team talked about this, though they couldn't see each other's faces, underneath those masks, everybody was smiling. The frigates, even though they had been farther from the battle, didn't actually do as well. Even though one was fully salvageable, the other ones looked like hell. Their thin skin was not something that could take any sort of hit. In one case, the entire side, the port side, was blown off. One stray shot looked like it had simply cut through the hull and sliced it like somebody was slicing a piece of cheese. It was crazy. The alien cruiser was surprisingly intact. It was difficult to get the aliens out, of course, as they, when they were found, were scared to death as they had no idea who or what had showed up to save them. Not to mention, many of them had a difficult time actually getting out of the few compressed areas they actually had. They worried, as each of the umbilicals would have to bore its way in and make a seal before anybody could be taken out. However, once they actually got into the human transport and were given instructions in their own language, they calmed down a bit. They were not calm, however, as they found out that all their frigates and destroyers were total losses, with the loss of all hands on them. Each of them seemed to give a strange movement as though they were praying, or was this a type of salute? Nobody knew. The admiral was still pissed and wanted answers as fast as possible. The captains were trying to give him as much as they could, as the intel trickled in slowly from the salvage teams. Thankfully, they were able to plug into a few of the hard drives left over in the alien ships, and they were able to get some more answers. However, the AI was having trouble sorting all the information as they had to go through each one, figure out how to translate it with all the different alien slang, and then put it together in something comprehensive. The fleet had to sit idle in space while this happened, and everybody involved was having difficulty dealing with the waiting game. As the intel of the invasion into Mugansloot territory came into view, they put everything up on a 3D monitor to see how the invasion happened. It was insane. The other three factions had come together and pushed through so fast it would seem like it came from one of the old sci-fi books, where they went across a territory and conquered 200 and some odd planets in just a few months. It was absolutely insane. However, this was nothing compared to the casualty reports that started to flow in. This gave everybody pause. Out of the 18 species in the Mugansloot faction, 5 remain, and 2 just barely. Quite literally, just barely, as one of the species had just over 5,000 out of tens of billions they had before, and the other species had just around 1,000 out of about 2 billion they had before. This was insane. This was genocide. As the reports rolled in, the anger began to grow around the fleet. Usually, as people are inside their own little capsules of a ship, they joke around and play games and things to keep their brain occupied. But no, everyone seemed focused and then more and more dedicated to get the job ready and get the job done. This became especially true as the official reports of losses in equipment from the alien invasion came in. Over 50% losses in equipment, as in total losses, completely unrecoverable, unsalvageable, even talking about slag that they could grab and simply melt down for new parts. When things are atomized, that doesn't happen. They also had a 41% loss of personnel. It would have been far higher, but human medical tech had gone up to the point where even people who had been spaced can be brought back. However, what happens afterwards to their body is not fun. It's a mix of dealing with the absolute worst hangover you're ever going to feel. As though you're defrosting a steak or coming out of hypothermia, your body feels like crap. There's no amount of medication you can get to make you not feel like total hammered shit for at least 24 hours. Even before the official reports came out, news had spread around human space. This, of course, brought a lot of interest, as this was going to be the first time humanity actually mixed with another species besides their own. This was very strange indeed. Species were actually surprised that a few people immediately showed up and wanted to pay them for their parts. With this, many of the Xenos started to freak out and run back as they thought they were going to be dissected. However, they were told very quickly that they mainly wanted blood samples and scanning them. That's all they wanted. They were interested in their biology. With this, most Xenos would take a very large amount of currency for just a small blood sample or two. After those, they have a lot of extra currency and a lot of extra resources to actually run to these planets for such samples. The aggro planets in Vorlon space were worried. They weren't set up for tourists, and they knew this was exactly what was going to happen. They had to adjust very quickly as interest grows. As it stands now, in that sector, outside of human, of course, there's 2 reptilian species that don't look very much like each other at all. One looks much more reptile than any type of human could be. The other one the other way around. One insectoid species, which had, of course, looked like any type of insectoid you would think, and 2 mammalian species, one of which was covered in a type of fur and looked almost like a walking koala. The other you could mistake for the old version of what they used to call a tiefling, as it was completely and utterly smooth, yet it was almost rough on the skin. This could be confused for a reptilian until you actually looked close and realized that they were actually mammalian, actually warm-blooded and things of that nature. The one thing they all had in common, though, as they were all humanoid. They might have one or two extra appendages, but sure enough, they looked humanoid. Even the insectoid species themselves walked upright, even though at many times they wanted them to actually wear clothes. The locals were having trouble stopping their children from looking at certain areas a little too close. That being said, their natural abilities were extremely helpful, especially when building things. The insectoid species do have wings and they can fly, which meant that they could relay things very, very quickly without anybody relying on repulsion packs or anything like that to try and move everything around, which sped up construction extremely quick. Some of the reptilian species are very, very strong, which definitely helped out a lot. To absolutely no one's surprise, the mammalian species ended up more in the hospitality industry as mostly cooks, waiters, and things of that nature. Reason being is they actually fit inside a kitchen. They didn't actually scare any of the people coming to look at the Xenos. They were helpful. And of course, the planets didn't mind too much, as this brought a lot of economy to them. Though integrating them was far from seamless, it seemed like everybody was doing the best they could not to insult anybody, to try and figure out their different eccentricities, and make sure that they all got along, as they needed this to make sure that their planet and their people was successful. 3 weeks after the defense of Vorlon space, another two fleets had arrived. One of these fleets would be staying, while the other one would be joining the first fleet to show and venture into the former Mugensloot territory. Perhaps there's a way they can settle this issue, at least without additional bloodshed. This made perfect sense because looking at the territories, it was a massive difference between human territory and the other three factions. It wasn't even close. You're looking at over 100 times their size. The amount of manufacturing they can kick out is just absolutely staggering, along with the amount of personnel they can bring to bear. Strength in numbers is still a thing, even in the ether of space. It can never be underestimated how important this is. The combined fleet was 2 human battleships, 16 destroyers, 24 frigates, which were a mix of torpedo frigates and drone frigates, and 72 corvettes. This would be attempt to bring peace through a show of force. They believed this would do it, as one battleship was enough to make the invasion fleet think twice. The jump itself is uneventful as most jumps are, but they jumped inside the system, unlike the other factions who would actually jump outside the system. They didn't understand why, but they didn't really care. Once they jumped in, they immediately orientated themselves and looked for the system's homeworld. They found it, and when they scanned it, they found the fleets around the homeworld. It wasn't nearly the size of the fleet that they had fended off before, but it was definitely big enough to cause them problems. They watched as the enemy fleet began to adjust its position as they had seen the humans blink in. The human fleet moved closer and closer and began to hail them. There was no response. They continued to move closer, but slowly. They had their sensors on as high as they could to make sure there wasn't any traps, just in case these fuckers were just as sneaky as humans were. But they didn't see any, and they kept going. There was still no response until they got 3 times lunar orbit, and then they received a message to don't move. At this point, the ships didn't need sensors. They could simply look out the observation deck and see each other, even though they were just dots off in the distance. They were still there. The enemy, who had told them simply to stop, just sat there. The admiral, trying to be as pleasant as possible, hailed them again and requested an audience. But there was no response for over an hour as they just sat there, staring at each other. Neither side charging weapons, they just sat there. Eventually, an image came into view. The 3D image that was common use showed something no one was ready for. Some sort of aquatic or amphibian, humanoid something was seen sitting on, well, basically looked like a large throne. It was decorative as all hell, and just seemed like a big old chair. Clearly, whatever it was well fed, to the point of sheer disgustingness to the human eye, and was covered with extremely flamboyant attire, so much that many of those looking actually turned their eyes away for a moment, as their eyes had to adjust from all the bright blaze orange, pinks, and greens that were coming off of it. The translated voice coming from this bulbous thing said, "What is your purpose here, human?" "Peace," is all he responded. "You would say something like that without referring to my title and rank. How dare you, human? How dare you show disrespect to me of all? I am the strongest in this entire sector. I lead most of the faction. I am on the council. You will show proper respect to me, as all others must do." It then reached out with its other arms and started to pull on chains. Chains that clinked very loudly. It is though they were decorative, as they were shining, almost nickel plated. With that, you could see other species being pulled in, most of which had chains around their neck area, if they had a neck. "Do your orders, slave!" Yanking the chains hard, one of the very skinny whatever it was yanked so hard that it fell over and then crawled over to its own master, along with the others. 4 slaves completely entered view, all of which looked weak and emaciated. Even though they weren't human, everyone could see that they were completely beat to hell, many of them having fresh bruises, some of them dried blood on them. And yet they still came over, and even though seemingly didn't want to, they simply raised some of the garb and started to service this alien. The admiral stayed stoic, but had to actually raise his hand and wave it slightly out of view to make sure the rest of the crew shut the hell up, as most of them were trying to stifle their vomit. On the screen, they could see the different species, and also they saw that this bulbous thing was female. The slave master didn't seem to be interested in the humans talking, as it enjoyed what it was doing. And then, as it began to reach its crescendo, it screamed out, "This is what those other ones should do. They deserve to be our slaves for denying us. They are ours. You will surrender them. They are our escaped slaves. This is their now birthright." The admiral, trying to stay as professional as possible, even though he wanted nothing more than to throw up and then down an entire bottle of whiskey at the sight of what he was seeing, simply raised his voice. "Excuse me, ma'am, but if you want to just threaten us, if you want to threaten our new allies like that, we could simply just operate our main guns and perforate your ship while you're still in it. Is that what you would prefer?" With what everybody could only figure was a grin, it simply said, "You wouldn't dare. We know you wouldn't even think about that because you care too much for these creatures." It then kicked the slaves away, one of them so hard that it flipped over backwards with a loud thump on the floor. Another one was swatted off to the side, and it stumbled over as well. "Besides, human, we understand that you would actually care, and you wouldn't want to destroy the planet on the other side. We've seen your weapon before, and we understand what it would do to the planet that you're trying to get us to make peace for. We would not ever think about giving anything to an upstart species like yourself." Realizing his bluff had just been called, this thing continued. I do have an offer for you, though, as it used its own cloak to wipe the mess that had been left behind by the slaves. You could simply join our faction. I'm sure you would enjoy all the benefits that come along with it, it said as it exposed itself again and then pulled hard on one of the chains, pulling a slave in again so hard that it fell face first onto the ground, unable to move. Even though you are an upstart species, you are strong, and I know we can do great things together, she said with almost a predatory grin on her face. The Admiral, remaining so stoic that he was barely even blinking, simply stated, Let us think about that, and we will get back to you. With that, he simply reached down, cut the line. He turned immediately to one of the screens on the side and addressed those who were watching. He didn't even have to say anything. The looks on their faces were enough to say it all. As they looked to each other, they turned all to one way, and one man in a dress uniform simply turned straight towards the recording, looking the Admiral right in the eyes and says, Your orders are clear. But before he could even finish, a buzzer came in along with a strange signal, and a voice burst across the entire bridge that said, Hey, don't start that party without us. The Admiral was confused for a moment. He looked at the screen, and then he saw other screens popping up all around him. 3D screens popped up all around him, and he was shocked for the first time as his jaw dropped open. As he looked across all these screens, a small grin started to appear on that stoic face of his. As he looked around his bridge, he saw the rest of the command crew with big shit-eating grins on their faces. A lone voice from the comm center just broke the silence and said, Well, they're about to find out.